Good day, students. Welcome to the subject Food Science and Technology 4. My name is Lusani Bangani, and in this recording, I will be explaining the concept of shelf life of food. In terms of the chapter outline, we're going to do a basic introduction to shelf life, getting into the categories of spoilage, since spoilage is just one of the indicators of the end of shelf life. We will then talk about the different categories of spoilage, explaining each and the factors affecting them. We're going to talk about means and ways of assessing the shelf life of a food product. And then we then also just briefly introduce the technologies that we know, or the processes that we've applied or we've known over the years of preservation that are applied to extend the shelf life of food. But the main focus then would be introduction of your alternative processing techniques, since this is one of the area that we focus in Food Science and Technology 4, the alternative processing techniques in food science. Okay, so in terms of introduction, we already know that food products, whether they are raw or they are cooked, they are actually a complex mixture of your proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and other micronutrients. So it means that we all know that since these are biological raw material or biological products in terms of makeup, they will definitely spoil over time. So it means that spoilage cannot be stopped completely, but then the rate of spoilage can be reduced, that it doesn't spoil as fast. So how the manufacturers via the food technologies do that, they usually alter the formulation of the product. They process the product, either drying or cooking, whatsoever. They package it in different type of packaging, vacuum packaging, modified atmospheric packaging. They store the product under conditions of maybe refrigeration or freezing in order to make sure that microorganisms don't actually multiply. And then it's also handled that way during your transportation from the farm to the factory, from the factory to the consumers, or in the retail industry. So in that way, by actually following all these different protocols, we are then increasing what we call the shelf life, extending the shelf life. So what is shelf life? So just before going into the actual definition, there are actually pictures of different food products at the bottom there. And what you see is where the manufacturer is instructing how that product should be stored. The margarine should be kept refrigerated. The full cream milk, which happens to be UHT milk, can be kept under normal ambient temperatures, but once open, it has to be refrigerated and used within 4 to 5 days. Keep in a cool, dry place for your cake flour. Keep refrigerated for amasi, canola oil. It says keep in a cool place, and maybe you can't see it properly, but it actually specifies away from light. So what happens is that it means that this food product is going to retain, or all these food products are going to retain their shelf life, provided those conditions are met. So based on that, then we can actually explain what shelf life means, or the definition of a shelf life. So the shelf life is actually determined as the time during which the food product will remain safe. Remain safe, that when somebody consume that product, they're not going to get sick, or they are not going to be intoxicated. And at the same time, at that time, the product retains all its desired characteristics. So what are the characteristics? So the characteristics will be sensory wise. It will smell, it will color wise, in terms of texture, it will still be the same. But most importantly, the other characteristics will be your physical, your chemical, and then your microbiological characteristics will still be the same. And at the same time, in that time, the food has to comply with the nutritional information that was supplied when the food was manufactured. So during the shelf life, if the protein is 20%, it has to stay 20% throughout that entire shelf life. However, all that, the food must remain safe. It must have desired characteristics, compile or comply with the nutritional information has to happen only when the product is stored under the recommended conditions. So if that product is not stored under the recommended conditions, then you cannot expect the shelf life to remain the same. Okay, so that actually definition is based on the Institute of Food Science and Technology. So meaning that at the end of shelf life, then the food is going to spoil, and when the food spoil, it's no longer acceptable to the consumer. The worst case of spoilage is when it becomes a food safety issue, whereby people can die because of illnesses like toxins of your Staphylococcus aureus, or people have diarrhea because they ate a product. I mean, think about listeriosis some years ago. And then in terms of less serious food spoilage will be when the color changes, the flavor, the texture. So your knickknacks are no longer as crunchy, they are now soggy. The aroma is no longer there, like it says banana flavor, but you can hardly smell the banana. So that is still food spoilage, but it's less serious because it's not bordering in terms of the health of a human being. And then another one that we actually overlook, which we might not be able to trace in terms of when you're just tasting your food, you can't say, I can taste that all the vitamin C has been depleted. I can taste that the protein is lesser. We cannot, but it is also some sort of spoilage when there's deterioration in terms of the nutritional composition. So it means that at the end of the day, when that happens, it means the food no longer meets its declared nutritional value. So it's no longer 10% of protein, it's now 6%, but that we cannot actually determine. However, in terms of all food products, it takes time to reach that point whereby the food spoils, but that whole time before the actual food spoils is known as the product shelf life. So what happens is that obviously, since food products are different, there's how many million different types of food products, they all have some variation in terms of open shelf life dating marked on their containers because they're different kind of food products. So the different types of open shelf life dating varies by product, region, manufacturer, and also in terms of the product type. So we have dates that include the sell by date, use by, best before, and very important that, in terms of these dates, how they go about helping the consumer, they actually help the consumer to decide how long must they keep the product after they buy it. And even when buying at the shop, you look, okay, this is pasteurized milk, so I'm probably going to use it for baking and doing this, so it's probably going to be finished in 2 days. So I'm still safe in terms of the sell by, use by, or best before. And very important, it helps in terms of stock rotation in the grocery stores. I mean, usually if you go to your favorite grocery store, if you look at the products, especially your perishables like your dairy, you will see that the shelf life of the food product, the best by or use by dates, are closer for the products that are in front. And then if you peruse on the products that are actually behind at the back, they will have a longer shelf life. So what I usually do, I usually take products from the back. But all the products are safe to eat. It's just human nature to want the best. Okay, so now when we mentioned that after a certain period of time, your food is going to spoil. So there's actually different categories of spoilage. So if a food spoils in a certain way, we can say this is what we call physical spoilage because the product does not look like what it used to be before. There's chemical spoilage that sometimes you won't even be able to know that the product has been chemically spoiled. And then microbiological spoilage, which can be seen because you can see microbiology-wise, you can still smell something that this is off. But what happens if bacterial toxins have been produced, like with the listeriosis problem some couple of years ago, I think that was 2018, if not 17, you could not smell the polony, you could not see any slime on the polony, but the toxins were produced and the product was already spoiled. So what happens is that in terms of this physical, chemical, and microbiological spoilage, there's actually an overlap, and I'll explain that as we go, that often spoilage in one category can help to promote spoilage in another. I'm just showing an example here whereby if you have an apple that is bruised, because when an apple is bruised, that's actually physical spoilage. But what happens when it becomes bruised, then the cells become disintegrated or open, whereby the contents come together and then oxygen present, enzymatic browning takes place, which happens to be a chemical spoilage. So that's when we say there's some overlaps, and then at some point in time, one spoilage will actually promote another. Okay, so in general, in terms of spoilage, your microbiological changes are primary importance for short shelf life products. And then when it comes to longer shelf life products, like your dairy products would rather go sour, and it's sour because of obviously multiplication of microorganisms. But when we talk about other food products, like let's say your sunflower oil that takes very long, that has a longer shelf life, usually chemical and sensory changes are usually part of the problem in terms of spoilage. Okay, so meaning that it's very important that as a manufacturer, one must have means to predict the endpoint of storage, because you cannot overestimate and underestimate the shelf life, because if you underestimate, it means a lot of products will be thrown away before their actual spoilage. And if you overestimate, your product might be on the shelf, but it's already spoiled, and that can have a reputation on the business. Okay, so some of the things that we're still going to talk about when we talk about assessment of shelf life, what we can do or what manufacturers can do is that they can monitor their microbial growth patterns and the number of spoilage to give them an indication of how does this product spoil, and other things like your non-microbial criteria. Those are more difficult to analyze, but we actually know that usually in terms of chemical spoilage, in terms of your nutritional depletion, things like vitamin C in orange juice is one of the criteria that is used to check the spoilage or indicate the spoilage as to if you have 30% vitamin C. If at the end of shelf life it's 10%, we consider that it's spoiled because now all that vitamin C has degraded. But that is just an example. We'll talk about that more as we go. So when we talk about the spoilage categories being your physical, chemical, and microbiological, all those are then affected by different factors. And those factors, there's two types of factors. We have what we call the intrinsic. So the intrinsic factors are factors that are within the product itself. It's the product makeup, is the product itself, and what your ingredients are in the product, and the nature of the ingredients that are affecting that spoilage. And then we also have the extrinsic factors, and those extrinsic factors will be factors like what is introduced to the product from the environment. Okay, so of the intrinsic factors, we have several factors. We've got the natural microflora and surviving microbial accounts of the product itself. We have the product formulation and composition. So if the product naturally has enzymes like your apple, so it means that it's going to affect how it spoils, because those enzymes will then want to react. The product formulation, what are the ingredients in there, and what is the nature of the ingredients? Does the ingredients raw material contains a high count of microorganisms? What is the natural microflora? The product makeup. What is the water activity of the product? What is the pH value? Is it a low pH value? Is it acidic? We already know in acidic pH, most microorganisms don't grow. If it's highly alkaline, then we know that that one might spoil faster. The availability of oxygen, as we know that oxygen will be available for mostly chemical reactions and also some microorganisms that are aerobic. Redox potential. What happens is that when we talk about your chemical reactions, your lipid oxidation, when you have your lipid oxidation, you can have your metals in there, and those metals, they affect the oxidation reduction, and then they can initiate the lipid oxidation. The nutrients in there, nutrients, you have your carbohydrates, your proteins, and your lipids. Those are actually substrates for most microorganisms and most chemical reactions. Lastly, are there any preservatives being present? Are there any natural or added preservatives in the food product? Because then it will also determine how long that shelf life is. As we already know, salting or the addition of salt binds more water and makes it less available for chemical reactions to take place. So those are your intrinsic factors. And then, as we already mentioned, your water activity being very important as one of the intrinsic factors that different kinds of chemical reactions would take place depending, or would be optimum or maximum or minimum, depending on the water activity and moisture content. So meaning that by actually manipulating the water activity of a food product, one can either extend or reduce the shelf life of food. So in terms of the extrinsic factors, so those are the factors outside of the actual product, but those will be the time and temperature profile during processing. Is it UHT? Is it pasteurization? How long are you pasteurizing? How long are you sterilizing the product? That will then affect the shelf life of the food. Like making an example, pasteurized milk has a shorter shelf life compared to your sterilized milk. Temperature control during storage and distribution, how that pasteurized milk or amasi is going to be handled during storage and distribution, is that we need to make sure that the cold chain is kept. Otherwise, the fact that it's pasteurized still has microorganisms that might grow if they are allowed to grow because of the temperature fluctuations during storage and distribution. And then environmental microbial count during processing, storage, and distribution. That will be the area, how clean the area is, because the microorganisms in there might then move or contaminate the product that's already made, and then that can result in high microbial counts. Composition of the atmosphere within the packaging. Is there oxygen in there? Because when there's oxygen that's within maybe a closed bottle, then you already know that it will diffuse into the product and some of those chemical reactions can take place. The hygiene, very important. The hygiene of the handlers, the people that are actually making the food. What's the use sterilizing the milk if it's going to come in contact with people that did not take care of their hygiene? Packaging materials and system. What type of packaging material are being used? What is the oxygen permeability rate, water permeability rate, and stuff like that? During storage and distribution and retail display, are those cheeses or whatever kind of dairy product exposed to light? As we already know, photooxidation takes place. And a very important, the last one, would be consumer handling. How is the consumer actually handling the product? Because remember, at the end of the day, the product is at the consumer. You go and you buy the product. That product has been maintained in terms of its cold chain. It was kept in the fridge from processing, transportation to the retail. But then the consumer decides to go buy the product on a hot summer's day, leave it in the boot, travel to parties, goes somewhere to a festival, and then remembered later in the evening, oops, I actually went to the shops, I have groceries, and that milk, that poor milk, would have been in the boot on a hot summer's day of 30%. So how does the consumer handle that? Because at the end of the day, you as a consumer, you're going to complain that the product is off, but without saying that, well, I actually left it 10 hours in the boot, thereby breaking the cold chain. So like we already mentioned, whilst all these factors that are relevant have an influence on the shelf life of a product, some actually have a greater effect and deserve more attention. And the most important ones will definitely be the time and temperature profile during processing, because processing in terms of HACCP is the critical control point, whereby the hazard is either totally eliminated or reduced. Okay, so now what we do is then we start talking about the different categories of spoilage. Now that we've spoken about the different factors affecting spoilage, but now we then focus on the different categories of food spoilage, whereby we're going to talk about the physical, chemical, and microbiological spoilage. So in terms of the physical spoilage, in terms of spoilage, what is physical spoilage? Physical spoilage is the spoilage in terms of the actual product, how it looks, you know. First of all, it includes damage, you know, when a fruit bruises or it breaks, fruit like your fruits and vegetables, they bruise, that might be due to falling or knocking on each other. And if maybe they are overly ripe, when they are being packed on a delivery truck, they press into each other, and in that way they bruise. So that is actually physical damage. The breaking of brittle products. Think about your chips, your Lay's chips. If they are in smaller pieces, you might find a few pieces, but however, if everything is in pieces, that actually is a damage, because you still want to hold a whole entire a potato chip that is not broken. So things like your potato chips, your breakfast cereals, ready-to-eat cereals, the pie crust, and crackers. So when they break, that is known as a spoilage. But sometimes it happens that when you get some of this product, you yourself break it so that you can be able to pour it in your mouth, you know, different ways of consuming products. But one of the most important physical spoilage would be moisture gain, or moisture loss, or moisture migration. So when you actually have food products like your powders, when they're exposed to high humidity, what happens is that they actually gain moisture. And when they gain moisture, what happens is that they become sticky. And then on the other hand, you also have high moisture products, the products that are nice and moist, but if they are in a dry environment, they actually lose the moisture and they become dry. Usually your bread and your biscuits would usually undergo this, and crackers, you know, those will then lose the moisture, and they also lose that sensory of being brittle, or the biting texture. However, then there's also migration, you know, migration whereby when you're eating a pie, because the pie filling usually has a high moisture, but you still want the flakiness of the pie itself, the pastry. But then what happens is when there's migration of the moisture into the pie, then it does not taste so flaky, it tastes soggy. So then it takes away that flakiness of a pie. So that's what we call your moisture gain, loss, or migration, migrating within the same product. Other physical changes will be, you know, changing in packaging material. Like, let's say when you buy a canned product and you find that the can is knocked, it is bent. So that is actually a physical damage. Or maybe the product is that the packaging is torn, or it's got a hole or something. Okay, so the one important thing about your physical spoilage is that you might look at a product that is broken, like your fruit that is brittle, your cereals that is broken, your potato chips, and not consider it spoilage. But the problem becomes when the physical damage actually leads to chemical and microbiological spoilage. Like, let's say this is a powdered product. The fact that it was dried, all the moisture was taken out, and that's its preservation method of drying, and it actually has a low moisture content. But if it's actually exposed to a high humid environment and the packaging does not have a high water transmission, or a low water transmission rate, what happens is that it actually gains moisture. By gaining moisture, the moisture content increases, and by increasing, that water is then available for microorganisms to what? To then start multiplying. So meaning the physical damage then leads to microbial spoilage. As I already mentioned, the bruised fruits and vegetables, what happens is that because of bruising, the cells are open, and what happens is that the enzyme polyphenol oxidase reacts with the phenols within the apple, and that leads to a chemical change known as browning. So that becomes a problem, even though I had mentioned that breaking might not be seen as physical damage, but if that physical damage then leads to microbial and chemical spoilage, it becomes quite obvious and undesirable. Okay, and then we also have what we call temperature-related physical spoilage. This usually happens both ways, in elevated and decreased temperature, whereby in increased temperature, as we know, increasing the temperature increases the rate of chemical reactions. And then, however, at lower temperatures, refrigeration and freezing, one would think that, you know what, we are reducing the rate of chemical reactions. But what happens is that our freezer burn can take place, chill injury can take place at those temperatures. One of the most important causes of physical spoilage would be when the temperatures are fluctuating. When temperatures are fluctuating, and then the ice crystals form in ice cream, and then it forms that grainy texture. It's not nice, so it causes ice crystals and things like freezing. Slow freezing will then also lead to that. Chilling injury, which then causes pitting, water soaking, and discoloration that's happening in your fruits and vegetables, as you can see in the picture. Like we mentioned, freezer burn, when the moisture sublimes in the freezer, and then it makes the flesh usually of your meat becomes dry, very dry, because of what? Of the moisture escaping at those low temperatures, because of the gradient in moisture between the product and the environment. And in that way, you have what we call freezer burn. And also at your low temperature and high temperature, especially the low temperature, what happens is that if the product starts freezing, especially if you have your mayonnaise or your emulsions, and then you also have some of those highly saturated fats, some saturated fats within the mayonnaise, and then what happens as you put it in cold temperatures, the saturated fat harden, and when they harden, they actually break the droplets, the emulsion droplets, or the interface, and in that way it destabilizes your emulsions, and therefore the emulsion breaks. So that will be your physical. Other physicals are in terms of increased temperature. The crystallization of sugar takes place at higher temperatures, and then in contrast, what happens is that when you increase temperature, you can actually reduce the staling of bread. Staling of bread will be the migration of moisture from the crust to the crumb. So in that way, the bread, when the temperature is increased, it actually reduces staling of bread. Another concept in terms of increased temperatures is sugar bloom. So what happens that with sugar bloom, when you have sugar bloom taking place in chocolate, when the chocolate is stored in a humid environment, what happens is that with that humidity on the surface, when that humidity gets into the surface of the chocolate, it then dissolves the sugar, and then that sugar moves to the surface. When that humid conditions, or it's taken away, when the water evaporates, the sugar remains on top. So the surface moisture, which usually forms when chocolate is stored in humid environment, or when it's removed quickly from a very cool environment, like when you take it from the fridge to a warm one. So like I already mentioned, the moisture dissolves the sugar, and after evaporating, it leaves behind the tiny sugar crystals, because remember, sugar dissolves in water, but when the water evaporates, it leaves that sugar that had migrated to the surface of the chocolate, and it feels grainy when touched. So that is known as sugar bloom. Which the other one then is fat bloom in chocolate, when the migration and recrystallization of cocoa butter, especially in higher temperature, causes a fat bloom, and then you can actually rub the fat on the surface of the chocolate. So that will be the physical spoilage. And then chemical spoilage, as we already mentioned, spoilage also occurs due to reaction breakdown of chemical components. Protein, lipids, and carbohydrates usually undergo chemical reactions depending on factors of water activity, what's the temperature, what's the pH exposure to light and oxygen. And as we already know, each and every reaction that takes place in food has got its different optimum conditions of enzyme activity, is usually reduced at low water activity, and the enzyme also have their optimum pH. So what happens is when this chemical reaction taking place in proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates, It affects the color, the flavor, the texture of the food, and most importantly, then the safety of the food.